Fuel Pulse Show podcast, where we talk about all things fuel for all kinds of people. I'm your host, Eric Bjornstad, and I'll be your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. Here at the Fuel Pulse Show podcast, we talk about all things related to all the different kinds of fuel that you use both at work, on the job, and at home. And we also like to talk about issues and trends affecting the things that use that fuel, whether at work, at home. And so that means that this podcast is really for everyone. And so what are we going to talk about today? Many of the past episodes that we've done here have talked about issues dealing with petroleum fuels like diesel fuel, and then things like fuel testing, how to diagnose and solve problems like microbial contamination, stability. We've had conversations with fuel storage tank professionals, both on the manufacturing and the service side, and we also do current events topics, like we did a recent episode on the Baltimore Bridge disaster and everything that's going with that. So one thing that we have not really had the opportunity to really dig into are topics that can lend themselves to a certain amount of misinformation spreading out there in the world. And I think that that is because the people who really know the most about these topics don't tend to get invited to the same kinds of platforms as the people who like to make their livings picking the low-hanging fruit of getting the clicks and the views by stirring up the worst fears and concerns that people have about energy topics. All you have to do to see this is spend a little bit of time on social media. Doesn't take long to see amateur experts waxing eloquently about how electric cars can't be the wave of the future because what happens if we have a snowstorm? That kind of thing. So today we have somebody who, while she may not have the answer to electric vehicles and snowstorms, although she might well have that answer, who knows, she does know more than most about a lot of these large-scale energy issues that, like it or not, we're going to find those intersecting with our lives more and more in the coming years. So today, I'd like to welcome Dr. Elizabeth Connelly to the show from the International Energy Agency. Dr. Connolly is currently leading the transport analysis in the Energy Technology Policy Division of the International Energy Agency. And she has served as the coordinator and the lead author of the annual Global EV Outlook report for at least the past couple of years. Right now, she is also the desk officer for the hybrid and electric vehicles and advanced fuel cell technology collaboration programs at the agency. Now, before she joined the agency, she worked with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, where she supported projects working on vehicle decarbonization and also hydrogen and fuel cell technologies. And last, but certainly not least, she has her PhD in system engineering from the University of Virginia. So I am very pleased to have someone here on the podcast who really knows a lot about an area that's prone to consumer misinformation. And I'm hoping that by the time we're done, at least some of that will have been cleared up. So, Dr. Connelly, welcome to the podcast, and should I say, go Cavs?
Great, thanks. Happy to be here.
Oh, yeah, and again, we're very happy to have someone with your expertise here on the show. And I know you said that you have an office in Paris, which means you get to travel all over the world on behalf of the agency. To kind of kick things off, what is your favorite place to travel?
Well, I have to say, the IEA has recently tried to lead by example and set net zero ambitions for ourselves. And so traveling for work is maybe a little less common than it once was. But last year I did get to go to Norway for a conference, and that was beautiful. It was in the fjords. So definitely an experience that I appreciate.
Oh, yes. I definitely can attest to Norway being a very beautiful place. That's where my family heritage is from, judging from my last name. And yeah, Norway's definitely a place I would highly recommend for anybody who has the means to travel there. Can you tell us briefly about the International Energy Agency? Kind of sum up, because I imagine most people don't really know what it is. They can infer kind of what it deals with just from the name. But can you give us a little bit more of a fleshing out of what the agency's focus is and what it's concerned with?
Sure. So this year is actually the 50th anniversary of the IEA, which is very exciting. So
Okay.
the agency was created in 1974, and this was in response to the oil crisis. And so the idea was that the agency would
Mm-hmm.
help coordinate a collective response across member governments. And so we're an
Okay.
intergovernmental organization, meaning that we have a number of member governments that we are following their guidance. And so from the beginning, our focus was on energy security, and that remains at the core of the IEA
Mm-hmm.
mission. Though, of course, as time has moved on, the concept of energy security, I think, maybe isn't as focused on oil as it was 50 years ago. And so we have an increasing focus
Mm-hmm.
on the reliability, affordability, and sustainability of the energy we use, and especially in this energy transition. In terms of what our goal is, it's basically to inform governments as well as the public in terms of energy issues. And we do this by providing data analysis and policy recommendations on energy related topics.
Okay. And that sounds like the IEA's got a pretty broad hand or pretty broad emphasis in a very, I don't want to underestimate this, but a pretty important topic for the world today, the energy. So, knowing that you can't speak for the agency as a whole because you are one person, but you can give an authoritative picture as to what the IEA views as important. What would you say what does the IEA view as the most important energy issue facing both businesses and consumers, unless they're both the same thing, in which case facing us today?
Certainly. I mean, I think the issue we're facing is scaling up renewables. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that goes for both businesses as individuals. I mean, individuals can make choices about
Right.
installing solar panels on their roof and all of this. But I think the challenge the world is facing is that with growing population and hopefully growing GDP per capita, we expect energy
Yep.
demand, at least the services that energy is currently providing, the demand for those services to continue growing. And so we need to figure out how to meet this growing demand in the most sustainable way possible. And that involves ramping up renewable power generation and renewable fuels, even including, in some cases, biofuels, and in the longer term, also potentially synthetic fuels as well.
Yeah, and talking about not just a United States focused approach, but talking about around the world, one of the things that I always remember is how the world is very different now than it was in 1974. And so you mentioned earlier that the IA doesn't have its sole focus on oil like it may have had when it started during the oil crisis. So now the most important thing, like you said, renewables, there's biofuels in there, but basically renewable energy is kind of the wave of the future, so to speak. And so that's very different than it was 50 years ago. And another big way that the world has changed is that the United States is now not the only country, so to speak, that's using energy. We've got countries that used to be afterthoughts in the world energy picture. Used to be third world countries, but they have exploding populations and they are using more and more energy. And so it seems to me that it's really important for what the IEA is promoting with respect to renewables, because with whether it's Brazil, India, obviously China is what it is, but I think it was only in the last maybe 5-6 years that the third world countries kind of tipped to using more energy as an aggregate than the first world countries. And when I'm looking at that, it makes me look at what the IEA is doing and what the IEA is promoting with regard to the importance of renewables is even more important than it used to be, because the world's not going back to the way it was. One of the things that is really prominent in there is this thing that they call the net zero scenario. So let's talk about that a little bit. So can you kick things off by telling, whether it's from a consumer standpoint or a business standpoint, what is the net zero scenario and why is it important?
Sure. So maybe a bit of background before getting into the specifics. So the IEA has historically um, looked at long-term projections of energy demand in under different scenarios. And so the IEA has kind of three core scenarios. One is based on stated policies. The other is based on announced pledges by governments. So this is kind of their climate ambitions and pledges. And then the third is what you've mentioned is the net zero scenario. And so this scenario is what we call a normative scenario, meaning it aims to show a possible pathway to meeting a certain goal. And in this case, the goal is for the energy sector to achieve net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. And this is consistent with limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I think, at least for governments, the purpose of having this scenario is to be able to help compare to our others. And so we have what we call this implementation gap that exists between what stated policies would get us and what government pledges would imply. And so this is basically showing, oh, here's the gap of what policy needs to be increased to do in order to meet pledges. And then we have what's called the ambition gap between our announced pledges scenario and this net zero scenario, which shows where government pledges might not be aligned with reaching net zero. So having these to compare to this net zero pathway is really helpful, I think, in pointing out where additional policy and ambition is needed. And we looked at the energy sector from a number of kind of end use sectors. So I work in transport specifically. And so here you can really try to focus in on what end use sector is where there are the biggest gaps.
Yeah, and it seems to me like, given what you just said about how there's an implementation gap and there's an ambition gap, the first thing that comes to mind with that is, if you know anything about the political scene here in the U.S., we've got two sides that have different views, shall we say, about what's important and how to get to wherever they think we need to go. And political power flips between them such that one presidential administration may say we might be more amenable to participating in net zero. And so they pledge to do certain things. The Biden administration has put things in action where trying to move the country towards at least a little more in that direction. The Biden administration could project, if we keep doing this, then in 20 years we will be here with respect to our energy usage and our carbon emissions. But then let's say that he loses the election. You have a very different administration that comes in, and they can change all that. And so it seems to me that one of the values of what the IEA does is you do the research and the data crunching to kind of help provide input to governments to see this is what you promised to do. The ambition gap, I guess, is where that might play in. This is what you're actually doing. And there's a gap between, if you keep doing what you're doing, then you're not going to reach your goal by this much. Therefore, we recommend that you also need to do X or Y. And to me, that's a pretty valuable thing, to have an organization of experts like the IEA that functions in that way. So with the net zero scenario, we just said there's a gap. There's an implementation gap. There's an ambition gap, as you put it. This is kind of a big picture question. What do you think, and the answer may look different depending on what part of the world you're looking at, whether you're talking about a first world country or a third world country. So answer as best you can. But what do you think is or will be the biggest deciding factor as to whether the net zero scenario can be met in the necessary timeline by 2050? Is it power generation? Changes to power generation? Or is it something more along the lines of changes in the transportation industry?
Yeah, so I mean, as you're mentioning, there are many pieces to this puzzle, and we certainly spend a lot of brain power looking at what exactly is needed to get to net zero, and we present one pathway to net zero. It's certainly not the only pathway, but we do try to figure out what maybe is a reasonable pathway based on what we've seen progressing and what we haven't seen progressing as much. And I think one of the things we've been doing is really trying to look at the near term, so looking at kind of 2030 milestones, because I think 2030 is a bit more tangible than 2050. And we have to get to 2030 first. So let's try to meet these milestones on the way to net zero by 2050. And so when we look at 2030, kind of the biggest reduction in emissions in our scenario from now until 2030 comes from renewable electricity generation. And so that's wind and solar mostly. And so these two things in our scenario play the largest role in reducing emissions. I think we also there's a lot of emissions reductions also coming from energy efficiency measures as well as electrification. And so these are all kind of very important levers in this road to net zero. And I think in our last report, so each year we update our net zero pathway slightly based on how technologies are being adopted and improving. And so in our 2023 updated net zero roadmap, we outlined several key milestones to 2030. And this included tripling installed renewable power capacity and doubling the rate of energy efficiency improvements and reducing methane emissions from fossil fuel operations. And I think what's really promising is that we've seen these targets were actually part of the COP28 outcome, where countries agreed to work collectively towards these targets. So I think it's very promising to see that the countries are committing to these kinds of milestones and working towards that. And so part of what the IEA does is tracking progress on achieving climate targets and these milestones for net zero, the COP28 outcome. So we're looking at how we're improving each year and how we're taking steps to getting towards these targets. And in one of our publications specifically, we look at the progress of kind of more than 50 different components of the energy system, which we consider critical for clean energy transitions. And so I have to tout that electric cars are one of 3 clean energy technologies that are considered on track with meeting the 2030 milestones for our net zero pathway. And so I can't claim EVs are maybe the most important technology for achieving net zero, but in our analysis, looking out to 2050, they do represent about 10% of the cumulative CO2 emissions reductions needed. So it's not an insignificant portion either.
Now, is that 10% figure, is that for a worldwide view, or is that relative to what the United States is supposed to be doing?
That's taking a world view. For the most part, our net zero scenario, we try to present it on a global basis because certainly different countries start from different positions. And so each country will have its own individual path. But as a world, we need to work towards these milestones and this pathway. We do show the net zero in terms of advanced economies and emerging and developing economies, acknowledging that we expect advanced economies to make the most efforts to have the greatest reductions in the near term, and the emerging and developing economies get to pick up from these learnings and technology improvements and follow a bit delayed path for decarbonization.
Yeah, and so when you talk about advanced economies versus emerging economies, there are some countries that it's pretty easy to put them into the right bucket. The United States, EU countries. China would, since they're, depending on who you talk to, either the largest or the second largest economy in the world, and I would say they're an advanced economy. What about a country like India or in Malaysia, Singapore, some places like that? Where are they bucketed?
Right. So, I mean, I must admit that in our definition, China is even considered an emerging and developing economy, as is India, Malaysia, and Singapore. And I think I find that surprising as well. I went to some climate negotiations last year, and I think that was really the first time I started to understand why we have that classification. And I think it has to do with, in the Paris Agreement, there was this we distinguish between advanced and emerging economies, and I think there's kind of different paths for those two categories. And I think at that time, certainly China and the others pushed to be considered emerging. And I think China is, in a sense, emerging, but it's, I certainly, with the respect to EVs too, it's kind of funny to not consider it one of the more advanced markets.
And plus with China, you've got, I know that you have to question the information that people have access to because it's so tightly, centrally controlled. whether they're talking about their economic growth figures. You can never take what they're saying with exactly at face value. But yeah, I'm kind of surprised as you were that they're classified as an emerging economy, but it is what it is.
Yeah, I should say for this reason, a lot of times in our reports, now we'll have advanced economies, China, and other emerging and developing economies,
Yeah.
because it is a very specific context for China.
I hope you enjoyed the first part of our discussion with Dr. Connolly, and there's more to come in parts 2 and 3, where we'll be switching our focus toward another issue that's popular in the news, electric vehicles. There's a lot to talk about, and Dr. Connolly is a particularly well-versed expert to speak on that issue. As always, we'll be putting links in the show notes to all the things that we talked about today. Now, if you haven't already, feel free to subscribe to the show at your podcast purveyor of choice and leave us a rating while you're at it. And we'll see you next time for the next episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast.